The 2020 J-Horror Month is upon us, and we're starting it off right by talking about these 3 spooky manga. The goal of this video is much less to review and more to recommend these series to read this October, similar to last year's horror manga video. That video was framed around a little horror history lesson, and while there's an interesting sample of time snippets between these 3, they connect much more on a thematic level. These are spooky manga. While definitely in the horror genre, they're not really scary. Instead, they're more about atmosphere, with a little sense of humor thrown in for good measure. There's a certain level of camp to all of these, but some have it more than others. So, let's get right into it and read some spooky manga. Orochi is a classic horror manga from legendary artist Kazuo Umezu, who you might be familiar with from his manga The Drifting Classroom, since it was in last year's horror manga video. Orochi predates Drifting Classroom, but only by a few years. However, the two series could not be more different. The manga centers around our title character. Oh no, wait, actually it doesn't. Orochi is hardly a character in her own manga, merely a passive observer of humanity as a whole. But the part of humanity that is the most interesting to her is the darker side of it. Most chapters feature a young protagonist facing up against very real and very adult fears. And Orochi watches it all unfold. You see, whatever supernatural entity she is never elaborated on. She's an ageless psychic that watches other people's lives unfold. Sometimes she's hanging around them for a week. In others, she's staying with them for decades. But Orochi always remains a background fixture in every single story, sometimes to the point where you have to ask, why is she in this plot at all? And honestly, I can't answer that. She gives these chapters some connective tissue for sure, but she feels shoehorned in on the rare occasions that she does directly affect the plot. Would these stories have been better without her? Probably, but honestly, it's one change that wouldn't change that much. That's because the real meat of the manga is the individual stories themselves. Now, with the horror label and Umezu's reputation, you might be expecting some far-out sci-fi gore fest, but Orochi really isn't like that. Instead, it's much more grounded in real fears. While the fantasy element exists, it's only prevalent in the first few chapters, and when Orochi herself comes into play. But the chapters are by no means tame. There's still enough murder, backstabbing, and child abuse going around to keep things nice and edgy. Running in a shonen magazine, the protagonists are young boys who quickly get in over their head. Cue the classic "no adults will believe me" tropes. The human nature of these terrors makes each chapter into more of a Hitchcock Presents for Japanese kids. In fact, one chapter is practically just Rear Window. They aren't really about scaring you so much as they are about building up suspense, and that suspense is only heightened because Umezu is not shy about killing kids. You know that things can go very bad very quickly for our protagonists, and because they're just one character in an anthology series, there's no reason to expect that they'll make it out okay. Most of the time, when our young shonen takes matters into his own hands, justice is usually served at the expense of a psychotic adult. But other times, things don't turn out so well for anyone involved. Still, some of the best stories are when Orochi follows around one character from their childhood into their adult years, all while they become ensconced in very unfortunate events. The most famous example would probably be the final chapter, Blood. Being over 200 pages long, this story is much more of a volume in its own right. It follows two sisters growing up in vastly different ways, as a dark family drama unfolds between them. It's pretty standalone, and that's probably why this was the only chapter released by Viz Media in English. The rest you can read thanks to scans that are maybe not the best, but the translation makes up for it. The first chapter of Orochi was adapted into a film, written by the screenwriter of the best Ring movies. I haven't seen it yet, so that's about all I could say on it. So while I can't speak for the movie, I can say that if you're into anthology-based, suspense-driven horror, then give Orochi a shot. If the quality of the scans is an issue, just read the chapters with good scans. Everything is entirely standalone. But if you want something a little bit more crazy, campy, and bloody, I'd look into Umezu's other works. Orochi isn't about that, which is why it's only going to get a 3.5 on the Edge scale. Remember Franken Fran? Please tell me that it's not just me. Franken Fran was, still is, a pretty popular manga. Or at least it had a dedicated cult following some years back. For those of you that haven't been introduced, Fran is a world-class doctor that dabbles in mad science. She's not exactly human, but she's not precisely a monster. As a doctor, Fran caters to a variety of patients, almost all of which meet with an unfortunate end as a result of their operation. You see, Franken Fran is a unique combo, consisting of body horror and comedy. It somehow manages to combine medical malformations and humor in a way that shouldn't be possible. The manga can swing from gruesome images into gags, while sometimes managing to do both at the same time. It's got a good level of horror camp to it, similar to Tales from the Crypt. In fact, the episodic story structure makes it an even better comparison. While Fran might not be our Crypt Keeper, as she is directly involved in all of these stories, each chapter is more about the people that she ends up operating on. A lot of these follow the classic monkey's paw formula, where some bastard ends up getting exactly what they wished for, only to have it come with a darkly karmatic consequence. But that might be selling Franken Fran a little short, because it takes from so many different genres that it's nearly unidentifiable. Some chapters are about medical anomalies that Fran delights in experimenting with. These usually are grounded in some real medical concept that's eventually twisted into something absurdly malicious. Other times, she's a schoolgirl for no other reason than that the plot to that chapter wanted to take place in a school. Cue plenty of high school hijinks, subverted by Cronenberg nonsense. And then the manga will just throw everything away for an absurd genre parody. You get zombies, murder mysteries, anime, daikaiju. In fact, there's a lot of tokusatsu parodies in this. Actually, the closest thing that Franken Fran even has to a storyline is a multi-chapter Kamen Rider parody, where the riders are basically walking collateral damage machines. It's so good, honestly, I would love to see a Kamen Rider manga by this guy because he clearly loves the series. Having an episodic format allows the manga to have this kind of diversity. While there's no overarching plotline, there are plenty of recurring characters and story elements. Fran's sisters, Veronica and Gavril, add enough violent spice to keep things fresh. Veronica in particular is able to carry chapters completely by herself, which turn out to be some of the best ones. Plus, the Yuri bait helps too. Plus, you have more minor characters like this bandaged cutie and a terrified police detective, two running jokes that eventually took on a life and character of their own. And if that wasn't enough, each volume also has an extra chapter, detailing character backstories, or sometimes just unrelated horror stories. While episodic, the chapters are not without continuity, with a lot of later chapters acting as mini-sequels. Of course, this is all connected by the title character herself, Franken Fran, and she definitely is a character. No, she doesn't have an arc, she doesn't even learn from her mistakes at all, but she's the type of character that you could drop into a situation and know exactly how it will turn out. From the first chapter, Fran is practically fully formed. Her quirky way of speaking, the admiration she has for her father/creator, the absurd way that she analyzes situations. Even after only reading a few volumes, you feel like you know this character personally, but you would never want to meet them in person. Fran is like a fucked up blackjack. She's brilliant, and she means well, but her operations almost always turn out disastrous in the end. She does legitimately want to make people's lives better, but she's just very bad at it. And the manga gets a lot more mileage out of this cutesy mad doctor type than one would expect. But I would hate to leave out the fact that Franken Fran has fantastic art. The author, Katsuhisa Kigusu, had to be good in order to get the body horror right. But at the very same time, everything also has this cutesy aesthetic to it. If Suehiro is Erogudo, then Katsuhisa is Moe-gudo. And if you're wondering what the author is up to now, he's actually working on a sequel, Frankenfran Frantic, which honestly I'm pretty happy to see happen. The format of Frankenfran is so versatile that he really can pick this series up years later to do new stories without it ruining anything. Anyways, I think at this point I've gushed enough. To be honest, it was really fun rereading this series for this video. Not only does it get a pass, but I would say that it's a must-read for the Halloween season. But, where's the edge? And the edge is everywhere in Frankenfran. Everything it parodies, every sincere moment that it sets up is undercut by cynicism. Every time that you think characters are going to live happily ever after, the final page shows something really horrible happening to them. And with the buckets of blood that's thrown at the readers, Frankenfran is definitely getting a 4 out of 5 on the edge scale. Read it for the ecchi, but stay for the edgy. Mieroku-Chan is one joke, retold every single chapter. And you know what? It's a good joke. In the 20 plus chapters of Mieroku that have been released, the joke hasn't gotten old for me. Of course, this joke is that our main character Miko can see ghosts and spirits in a Sixth Sense sort of style. That was a lot of S's, I hope that recorded okay. She tries her hardest to pretend not to see them in hopes that they won't attack her. Rinse, repeat, and slowly add in recurring characters and plot elements to keep things fresh. Toss in Miko's best friend, who attracts ghosts, a rival spirit medium, and then you have enough variety that the manga doesn't become so stale. Mieroku-Chan was originally published on the Japanese art website Pixiv, and from there it grew into a fully serialized manga. This is artist Izumi Tomoki's first big work, and it does seem to have struck a chord with a lot of people. But that also means is that there's some growing pains in the early chapters. Being a literal webcomic, the art starts off a little amateurish, and very quickly improves as each chapter is released. I didn't even really notice until I started flipping back through images that I had saved from the first volume. Even when it was in its early chapters, Miko's creepy little specters remained a high point for the series. The ghosts range from corpsey to Lovecraftian, each with their own little design cues giving you some insight into who they were or what they might be. That's because this manga isn't really focused on telling the story of a badass exorcist girl. In fact, it goes out of its way to make fun of that. Miko is a passive part in all of this. So in the very brief encounters that she has with spirits, you need to learn as much about them as possible visually. You might see these ghosts and go, oh no, that looks too spoopy for me. But it actually isn't. Much like our other protagonists, Miko often acts as an observer in someone else's horror story. And because of this, Mieroku-Chan prioritizes comedy over scares. It is the least scary manga in this video, probably the least edgy manga that I've talked about on this channel, but you wouldn't know that just from seeing a couple pages of the monster designs. And as far as Mieroku-Chan has gotten, plot threads have started to appear. It's clear that there's still a lot more of the story to tell, and we are very far from the end. If anything, we are right at the beginning of the story. So is what we have right now worth a read? Well, I would say yes. The early chapters are self-contained and will give you what you want, and that's if what you want is cute girls being scared of grotesque monsters. For the Halloween season, this definitely falls into the spooky fun category, rather than the creepy horror of Umezu. So if you're in the mood for something that has the same tone and atmosphere as a bowl of Count Chocula cereal, this might be right up your alley. But this begs the question, should I keep up with Mieroku-Chan? And to that, I would actually say no. The entire thing is a very spooky slice of life, which is good for reading a bunch of chapters in a burst, but the actual plot is slow moving. It doesn't help that this is a monthly manga and not a weekly one, although translations seem to stay on top of the current chapter. So for now, you really shouldn't have to worry about fan translators going dead. Well, you might actually have to worry about fan translations, because Mieroku-Chan is getting officially released a month after this video is out. So maybe if you're still in the Halloween mood in November, you can go and pick up a copy. The first volume will give you a very good idea of what you're in for right off the bat. As far as Edge goes, we are going to give this series a very low 2 out of 5. I would give it a 1 out of 5 if it weren't for this one-off ghost that is in an oil drum. If you know what this is referencing, then you might want me to bump the rating up higher, but I think we're going to just add on a point and move on. If you haven't caught on already, there's a lot to link between these 3 episodic manga with a female lead. Orochi is extremely hands-off, while Miko is probably the most involved. The former goes for a horror anthology format, while the latter falls in line with the slice of life genre, which I would like to say is because they're both a product of their time, although neither slice of life or horror anthologies are exclusive to either of the time periods in which they were made. Franken Fran is its own thing, which is fair because the manga itself is known for defying genres. But I can't help but think that without the groundwork laid by Umezu and later Junji Ito, we wouldn't have had a Franken Fran. While the focus on female leads in horror is a topic for its own discussion, I think we have a wide range of how it's handled. Miko is used to show how imposing and terrifying ghosts are, so she's designed around looking and acting like your typical schoolgirl in a horror book. Brave as she might be, Miko is still at the mercy of the spirits around her. Fran is almost the inverse. Her design plays on the moe aesthetic, but she's practically a monster herself, and almost always has the agency in her own story. And I'm sure that there's a lot more parallels you can draw out of these 3 series. Maybe you want to leave them in the comments below. But that's where I'm gonna leave it for now. All 3 are fantastic for the season, so please give them a read this October. Next week, we'll be moving away from print and onto... Oh, hold on a second. I'm getting a phone call. Oh no, I didn't pick it up in time. It looks like I have 1 missed call.